My name is Brad Lusk. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Mathematics, or STEAM team. The STEAM team is an affinity group within the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program. And we're essentially a group of fellows who are interested in promoting STEAM and promoting the multi-directional exchange of values between scientists and members of the community. And we do this in 3 different ways. So we try to incorporate the arts into STEM, hence STEAM. We try to promote diversity, equity, inclusion in STEAM. And we also encourage our fellows to become effective science communicators. Dean Oliver is here to tell us about his journey and also writing a book called Basketball on Paper. And essentially what Dean has been able to do is kind of use the mathematics and statistical skills that he learned pursuing a PhD in environmental engineering. He's learned how to take those and apply them to the art of sport, in this case, basketball. And so this has led him to be coined, quote, the godfather of, or one of the godfathers of the NBA analytics movement. And so Dean is going to explain to us how it is that he managed to turn his PhD into something as incredibly useful as being the assistant coach for the Washington Wizards, and how he is able to use that now to kind of change basketball in the way we think about the sport. So with that, Dean, I'll turn it over to you. We look forward to hearing from you.
So my understanding is everybody here on here has a PhD. Is that right? Well, for the most part, well educated, overly educated,
for better or for worse, I guess.
And all science and everything. So yeah, I certainly relate to that. When I'm in high school, certainly I knew I was good at math and science. I love sports, without a doubt. It was something that I played. I played basketball. I ran cross country. I ran track. I enjoyed those. I wasn't the greatest at all of those. I knew that okay, these are all fun. I enjoyed competition in general. But I knew implicitly that wasn't going to be a career for me. When I was 15 years old, my dad bought me a book called The Baseball Abstract from Bill James. And Bill James wrote about baseball from a statistical perspective, which spoke to me at that time. It was like, oh, okay, how do we describe baseball using statistics? The word analytics was at least 20 years away from being invented. So for me, it was like, oh, this is just an interesting way of writing about baseball. And I loved basketball. I always figured, okay, well, maybe I can adapt what he's doing to basketball. And when you're 15 years old, 16 years old, and even though I was good at math, I tried to take what he did and bring it over to basketball. I was 15 or 16 years old and an idiot. I mean, it's much harder than that. But I gave it a try. I tried some things and then finished the rest of the high school. It's one of those things that's kind of on the side. I go to college at Caltech in Southern California, and I play basketball for the team. And now I don't have to take any English classes. I don't have to take history classes. I don't have to take all these crazy classes. So swimming in my brain on a regular basis is basketball, which I do after classes, and then all these classes in math and science. And first of all, going to Caltech was an education in itself and in my knowledge and understanding about yourself, because I was valedictorian. I knew a lot. Like I was finishing in the top 3 to 5 in the state in math and science things. And I got there and I'm like, oh my God, everybody's so much better than I am at a lot of these things. But I was good at a lot. I just wasn't the best at anything. And that was frustrating. But so I survived my freshman year, and I finished finals about 2 or 3 days before I was supposed to fly home to see my parent, to stay with my parents for the summer and work a summer job and things like that. And the NBA finals were on. And what happens when you get through a brutal school year is you can relax. And I was able to sit down and watch the finals. And what did I do? I just took out a notebook and I started writing down on paper what was going on in the game in an organized kind of scientific perspective. Okay, what's where the ball is moving from here to here, here to here, and then what happened and what happened. And I just wrote down the observations in as neutral a perspective as I could. And the structure at which I was writing things down, I was writing down a line per team. And it sounds crazy right now, but that fundamentally changed the way the sport is viewed. The fact that a team has a possession, it goes from one possession, the team has possession until they lose possession. Then the other team gets the ball. It's very simple, but at that time, people were evaluating teams and players based on how many points they scored in a 48-minute game. And it turns out the most important thing is not how many minutes you play, but how many opportunities you get, those possessions that you keep. And some teams are faster, some teams are slower. And to this day, that is one of the most important insights that I gave the game of basketball, is from my freshman year, writing down what was going on in a game and using that as a basis for how effective teams were, as opposed to per minute. And it opened up from then. So continued to play basketball at that point, and played basketball the next year. Kept doing this, kept writing down in games that I had time to write things down, and was thinking math and science. But like, it was just maybe someday I'll just like write a book. That was the concept. After my sophomore year at Caltech, I worked at UCLA. It was a 10-week internship. And after the 10 weeks, I still had, I think, 4 weeks or 5 weeks. I said, let me give this a shot. Let me try to write a book. And you find out how hard it is to write a book. It is insane. I enjoyed it. I loved it every day, and waking up. So this is 1988, and computer technology is not nearly what it is now. Concept of a spreadsheet. I still had a piece of paper that they called a spreadsheet, and everything. But I was going through the process of having to take these descriptions of the game, these analytical descriptions, some very simple math of points scored divided by possessions played, and working on the basics of that to describe how the game went. And how do I write about this? How do I make someone like all of you who are on this call, how do I make my parents, who are not the biggest sports fans, how do I make them care about what I'm writing about? And you realize that's a pretty good audience to aim for, is frankly you, educated people in science who, like, okay, maybe a little bit interested in sport, but not a lot. And ended up being kind of the people that I tried to write for then. And I just wasn't very good at it when I was 19 years old. But I gave it a shot. I wrote it. I printed out about 10 copies of it. Half of those, I don't know where they went. I think a few went to like my parents and stuff like that. And some friends and things, and I think I still have a copy or two myself. That experience was huge. The experience of doing that, I look back on some of the things, and most of what I wrote was not very good, but some of it was really good in its intent. And I think that ends up being a very important part of this transition. How do you go from science and technology and all the formal education there to having to communicate it? If you're talking about how we do science communication, you have to fail at it a few times. There's no doubt about that. And some of it did connect with people, and you learn from that, and you can go from there. So the next couple of years in college, I stopped playing after my sophomore year, and I ended up just joining the coaching staff. And coaching actually is communication. A lot of how do you teach some of the stuff? And because I was coming from a little bit different perspective, because I had done some analysis of it, how do you communicate this stuff? The fortunate thing at Caltech, everybody there is a scientist. So I could communicate that decently. So graduated from Caltech after 2 years of coaching, after 2 years of playing. And so I did apply to graduate schools, the usual ones that Caltech people apply to, from Stanford, MIT, Harvard, Hopkins. And then I threw in the North Carolina thing. Like, oh, they've got a good environmental engineering program. And so why did I do environmental engineering to begin with? Is because, like I said, when I got to Caltech, I wasn't great at anything. And environmental engineering was a combination of chemistry, biology, physics, math. And I'm like, okay, I'm pretty good at putting all of this stuff together. And so environmental engineering is kind of what I focused on at Tech. They didn't have the major. And then, so looking at those schools, they all had that good option, including North Carolina. And I said, I want to go to North Carolina because, first of all, my family has never lived in the South. It would be good to get that experience, that exposure to do that. And they have a much better basketball program than all these other ones. And I have never regretted it. It ended up being one of the best decisions I could ever make. Going down there, I got a very good education in environmental engineering. And at the same time, my college coach, when I was an undergrad at Caltech, hooked me up with the Los Angeles Lakers and said they needed a scout. They need someone to do scouting out there. It's not a lot of time, which was good. And I was able to scout, I don't know, like 8 to 10 games a year and work on that, and basically spend all night writing up a scouting report and get beer money out of it, really. So that I'm like, oh, okay, a little bit of extra money in grad school is a good thing. And I got to do basketball. And during that period, as I was taking a lot of formal stats classes, actually, at that time, I realized, oh, there's some application of formal stats to basketball. Law of large numbers, a lot of things with some basic Gaussian stats and covariances, and how teams tend to play up or down to their opponents. That's a statistical thing. Like, we can measure this sort of thing. And you could use some of that. So I actually wrote an academic paper on how to use statistics to evaluate basketball. Couldn't find any place that would take it. I didn't even know what journal to try, but it was, well, I wrote it up with citations and everything like that. And it basically led me to believe that I was a little too far ahead of the curve on things. So I was scouting, I did all this, finished my PhD, and I could have gone into scouting full time, but it doesn't pay much. And so let me do engineering. And I also figured that I will never get that far away from basketball. It's something that I just love, I like it. I'll probably do it on the side where, and sure enough, I got a consulting job in engineering out in the San Francisco Bay Area, and was doing that, enjoying it, actually really enjoying a lot of the work for many years. And what ended up happening is, like, that was the beginning of the internet too. So 95 to about 2000 or so, beginning of the internet. And I decided to post some of my stuff on a webpage. I created a webpage in 1995 called the Journal of Basketball Studies. And I was just writing about this stuff. And I think, frankly, there were probably like 500 sites on the web or something at that point. So I was like most popular, but it was 500 sites. It's nothing like now. And so, but that was good. It got me a lot of exposure. It forced me to write about basketball and science together and make it entertaining, because all of a sudden there were, I mean, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who actually cared about what I was writing. Okay, this was good. And so did that for a few years, migrated over to, there was a company, oh God, it was called a mining company, which has become something else, but it was precursors of all these search engines and everything. And they wanted me to write about basketball, and they paid me monthly to write about basketball and science. Like, okay, I'll do that. And when you have to do that for a couple of years, you realize you got material for a book. But I was enjoying my environmental engineering job, which was paying most of my bills. It was paying all my bills, frankly, at that point. And I did that, but I did feel it inside, like I got something that other people don't know how to do. Even though I was writing this and putting it out there, and there were people who were starting to like, oh, maybe I can do this too. We developed a small community on Yahoo, like groups, which was early chat communities talking about all of this stuff. And then, so it's amazing, like stories go back to 9/11. So 9/11, so September 9th, 2001, I mentioned the baseball abstract by Bill James that I read in 1984. So September 9th, 2001, I write to Bill James, email, and I tell him, I'm thinking of writing a book. And it's about basketball. It's doing kind of stuff that you want to do, you've done in baseball. I may need some help with a publisher. And Bill James is kind of famous for it. He will reply to emails. And so he replies to me that day and says, why don't you send me some of what you got? I'll look through it and see if I can help you. Oh, okay, this sounds promising. So I gather up all my materials. I send it to him September 10th. September 11th, of course, in the morning, the world goes crazy. And like, I'm not thinking about Bill James, or I'm not thinking about any of that for a while. A few months go by, I didn't hear from him. And that's when I started like, oh, I wonder, like, obviously the world hasn't been normal, but let me hit Bill James up. And this is January of 2002. And I write him. And he says, yeah, thanks for sending me the stuff. Now I'm thinking of writing my own book. And I got the email back from him when I was at work, and I almost quit on the spot. I got to beat Bill James. And I slept on it. I came back in the next day and then had to do the massive explanation to my boss that I've basically been living this other life doing basketball stuff. I had to explain who Bill James was. And I said at the end, I either need to quit to write this book, or you need to give me time off to do it. And she said, that's a hell of a story. I will let you take the time off. And so I took 7 months to write a book in 2002. It was done in September of 2002, with the exception of a couple things here and there. But in that process, I got lucky, incredibly lucky, for two things. One was, so I had a friend who got married, and I remember I was hanging out with him, and I had written the entire outline of the book on the plane flight to his wedding. And I get out to his wedding, and then completely out of the blue, I get an email from someone named Pete Palmer. And Pete Palmer was the rival to Bill James. And he asked, can I help you? And first of all, I've never gotten an email from Pete Palmer before. And I had to say, is this the Pete Palmer? Is this like, and can you help me? Like, yeah, I need a publisher. So he contacted me because about a year before I had put out requests for volunteers to help track women's basketball. And that's what he was asking about helping me with. Not helping me with a publisher, but he ended up getting me the publisher a couple months into the process of writing the book. So that was one miracle. While I was writing this, so I was living up in the San Francisco Bay Area up until I decided to write the book. And a friend of mine in San Diego said, come live with me down in San Diego, write the book in the basement, gets you away from a lot of distractions. So I was down there. It was the first year in several years that I hadn't been going to Oakland A's baseball games. And Oakland A's, I was going for like 20 game packs, and it was a good way for me to get a little bit of baseball. And I would actually go there and work sometimes, actually, but that's another story. So I was down in San Diego writing this book, and when I was done in September, like, okay, it's good. I got my publisher, sent it all off. I did a lot of the work to get various endorsements, and then going through the process of the editing and everything. And they told me, okay, this will be coming out in October of 2003. In April of 2003, a friend of mine calls me and says, turn on the radio, NPR. There's an interview with a guy who's doing exactly what you're talking about. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? So I turn on the radio, and it's Michael Lewis talking about Moneyball, the baseball book that he has written about the Oakland A's, who for the first year in many years I didn't go see, and how they use statistics to improve their baseball team. And listening to that was the first time I said, oh, I think I can quit my job. I knew there was a chance that what I was doing could turn into a career. There was no guarantee at that point. I mean, this hadn't hit the NBA. So in October 2003, several months later, book comes out. My publisher didn't believe in the book, so they did no marketing on it whatsoever. Expect that. If you're doing something new and different, they're like, I don't know. I talked to local bookstores and everything and see if I could get some more prominent display or anything like that. No, it was hard to get anything. But when I saw the first copies, I said, I am gonna quit. I'm gonna give this a shot. I had nothing. I had nothing lined up. But I put in my notice in November that I would be leaving right after Christmas. And they told me, you want to stay until January 2nd, because January 2nd, you get the benefits for the whole next month. All this, like, okay, I don't know any of this stuff. I didn't know a lot. I knew that I was going to be staying on friends' couches. I knew I was going to be driving around and trying to make my way to talk to a lot of people, using my book as my business card. And that is what happened in January 2nd, 2004. My last day at the office, I headed off into the sunset with my books in a small car, a pair of basketball shoes, small piece of luggage. And that's, I started traveling around, made uninvited visits to a number of people. I had established some contacts within the NBA. I was able to send some books, and people helped me for sure. Drove around, and I flew to the East Coast, rented a car, drove up and down the East Coast, got some really good meetings that went nowhere, other than they got to know my name. And that was huge, because you realize when you're trying to start something new, it's about getting your name out there. Everybody is afraid to be the first one to jump on board, but they are happy to spill your name to a lot of people. So I did that. I came back to the West Coast. I was sleeping on another person's couch at that point. And then Summer League came along. So basketball has summer leagues where fans like me could go pay and see very bad basketball in the summer, and go do that. But it gave me the opportunity to talk to more people, get my name there. There was one NBA person who actually said, I will pay you for the book. You don't have to give it to me. Okay. So these kind of things. I had some really good conversations with people like him. I had some really bad conversations with other people who's, if it's not going to help me coach the next game, if it's not going to help me pick the next player right now, like what good is it? So you go through all of that. I met famous players, some of whom were semi-interested, most of whom like, go talk to him. And I did a lot of that. So summer league ended in July, and I had nothing. I had nothing at all other than a lot of contacts. And then in early August, I got a call from one of the teams, and they offered me dirt as money. But it was a foot in the door, and I took it. My first year with them, I went up there and I talked to them. They said, the coaches aren't going to be very interested in what you have to do. It turns out the coaches were interested in what I had to do. And we ended up, we were picked for last in the Western Conference. We ended up one of the best teams, and it was a little bit of luck, a little bit of my help, but a lot of luck. And all of a sudden, they were writing stories about what I did, and probably giving me more credit than I deserve. But hey, it was good publicity, and I started off on a career that I have never had to retreat from. The people that I had worked with in the environmental consulting company, they thought I'd be back within a couple of years. I still talk to them. They're friends, but they were wrong. So since then, so that was 2004-05 season. Since then, I have changed teams a couple of times. One of the nature of this business, and probably true within a lot of our business, when you work for entertainment, things change a lot. So I worked with the Sonics the first 2 years. They sold the team. They wanted to keep me on, but they said, we'll pay you, but you probably won't have to work for a year. And I said, I think it's more important for me to work than to necessarily get paid. And another team came, brought me in. I worked for them for a great 5 stable years. We won. We almost got to the NBA Finals, and they still fired the general manager who brought me in. And so the job got less stable. And ESPN called me and says, we're starting a sports analytics group. It was around this time that the word sports analytics was invented. So I went to ESPN. I worked at ESPN building an analytics group with a number of people, masters, bachelor students, smart people in general. And we were able to apply a lot of statistical skills to sports. And it's a much bigger group now. I left after 4 years or so. I worked with a sports analytics company for a while, and then I joined the Wizards almost 3 years ago now, to be an assistant coach. And every step has been both fun and hard, because when you're trying to push the envelope, nothing is easy. As much as I did to kind of lay the framework for how to do it, I've written books, I've had articles, I've given talks, and I talked about how it works. And you realize that helps everybody else. And how do I stay ahead, which means pushing it. So that's where I am now. I met Brad through my wife, who was AAAS fellow, and we got to know each other one very cold night at a restaurant in DC. So now I'm here. That's the basis of the story. There's details that I've left out. There's some science behind it that I could talk about that I really enjoy. Actually, the science of what I get to do on a daily basis is great. Data science didn't exist when I was in college. Now it's a major. I talk to kids, high school kids, about data science. It's great. So, but I've also spoken for 30 straight minutes, so I don't like doing that. It would be nice to let's have a conversation. So let's do that.
All right.
Let's do it.
Thank you, Dean. Looks like both Chris and Ryan have questions. I think I saw Chris's hand first. So, Chris, do you want to start off?
Sure thing. And Dean, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Yep.
So I'll be perfectly upfront and say that I'm not a sports person, but I'm really interested in kind of the application of big data and statistical tools to kind of break down and optimize systems. And
Yep.
I remember reading something, some article a while ago talking about how over the last several years, you've seen a lot more three-point sharpshooters on basketball teams because the statistical analysis shows that it's a little more advantageous to just stack your team with sharpshooters who can sink threes than it is to, build a well-rounded team that can pass the ball around. So I wanted to ask a little bit about. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how what new basketball strategies have emerged from this, Moneyball era of basketball, and how has it changed the game?
Yeah, it's so funny that it took someone like me to explain that 3 is bigger than 2, and it's fun, kind of a simple way, like, it's not that hard, and you can you go to the extreme of multiplying 3 by the probability of making the shot, and I'm like, 2 times the probability of making the shot. 3-point shots have evolved immensely, as have the counter strategies, which is how do we take away 3-point shots. There's before I wrote the book, the concept of switching on defense, so you don't just guard the same guy all the time, you guard base. If you have an opportunity to change on another person because it limits other advantages, you do it. Very analytical thing, because we looked at the data and the data said, it actually works pretty well. Part of the problem for a long time is there wasn't good data on this. What we have the advantage of in the NBA is about 9 years ago, they put the first cameras out. They put the first camera system out there that has 6 cameras that track the location of all the players in the ball. So we have that information. That it's funny how many people in the NBA complain that it's not enough data, and we haven't done enough with the data that already exists. Yes, it would be nice to have hand position, shoulder position, where they're looking, where they're facing, all of that kind of stuff. You can always imagine more data, but using the data that we have to the maximum extent is, I think, what helped get me into this sport. Is I used basic box score data and play-by-play data to understand what we could from that and maximizing that. Kind of back to your question, other things that have changed, I think what we've seen is transition offense. So in the 1990s, there was a heavy emphasis on transition defense. And one of the analytical things we realized is transition defense has a hard time stopping transition offense. If you push it, you can actually be pretty good at that. The Golden State Warriors took advantage of both the 3-point shot defense and going in transition on the offense as well. They ran a lot, and they took advantage of switching defenses. So they did all 3 analytical things, and they won multiple championships. I would like to say that the teams that I did took full advantage of that, but some teams adapt better, and frankly, some of their skills were better suited. So their players that they had were better suited for some of those strategies at first. And then there's a number of things that get a little bit more subtle, for sure. But one of the fundamental rules in my mind of analytics is taking full advantage of the skills that your players have, which is going to be different depending on the players that you have.
All right. Thanks, Dean. Ryan, looks like you have your hand up. You want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dean.
Yep.
I am a bit more of a sports fan, and I liked how you were talking about picking grad schools, and one of the things was the sports team. And it wasn't my main thing, but I enjoy football, and Louisiana State's good at football. So that's one of the reasons I went there. And it worked out well, especially in 2019. I guess my question relates to how do you balance kind of looking at that analytical approach, but realizing, some of the caveats of it, whether it be like a psychological, or I guess I'm thinking in terms of like in the NFL, they have the combine and they take, all sorts of metrics for guys, speed, hand size is important for a quarterback, all the way out to like more coaches go for 2 now than 1 because statistically it makes more sense. But the flip side of that, I would think, is there's a psychological impact on a team when you don't get the 2 points, and that kind of penetrates into momentum. So how do you bring that into the equation? And it may be different sport to sport, but sometimes it might statistically make more sense, but if it doesn't work out, it has more of a negative psychological impact that then trickles down to performance later on in the game.
The psychological impact has gone away, though, hasn't it? Right now, teams are used to it. It's that psychological impact is fear of the unknown. That's what it is. And if you have a coach that believes, because they understand it, that that's the best way to do it, and that you get over that. It's fear of the unknown. It's not fear of anything. It's just like, okay, we haven't done it this way. Everybody's nervous to do it the first time. Every entrepreneur that thinks they're doing something the greatest, you're also scared because you haven't thought of something. And that's what it is. So that psychological stuff goes away when you're accustomed to it. Like the Golden State Warriors shot threes because no one was shooting threes like they were, but okay, we won a few games with it. Let's keep doing it. It goes away. Ideally, certainly if you fail at it the first time, you might be gun shy. But if you do it 3 times and then it fails on the 4th, some people will still be nervous and they're like, they won't do it again. But that's what it is. It's simple fear of the unknown.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I'm thinking just like going for 4th down a lot. You see it so much more in the NFL now, again, because statistically, within so much, it makes sense and it is becoming more normalized.
Yep. And then the trauma's gone.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, Chris, back to you.
Thanks. Okay, so I always feel weird bringing this up, but I promise this is going somewhere. So a couple years ago, I was on the game show Jeopardy, and as I was preparing for the show, I learned a lot about the history of the show and the history of Jeopardy's strategy. And I learned that since about 2010 or so, there have been a lot of data-driven strategies for the show to optimize gameplay. And now when I watch the show, I feel like I'm seeing the Matrix. Like I can tell which contestants have come prepared and what strategies they've learned about and are deploying in the show by the way they how they select clues on the board.
Sure.
But this proliferation of data-driven strategies to some people has made the show less interesting, and it has resulted in more frequent winning streaks. So in the last season, for example, we saw 2 millionaire contestants in the form of Matt Amodio and Amy Schneider. And I've also heard from sports fans that the Moneyball era of sports and these data-driven optimized strategies have made basketball less interesting. Do you think that these applying big data to a sport, whether it's baseball or basketball or otherwise, makes the sport less or more interesting to watch?
I think there's a potential for both, for sure. For me on the baseball side, I feel like I have okay, I know a lot of the important things. There has been talk, and the shift in baseball is huge, and this shift has made baseball less exciting for some people. And I can see that. I think in basketball, maybe because I'm biased, but I feel like it hasn't done that in basketball. And I will tell you, I feel like the league office tends to agree with me. I think they have they love the way the game is now. There are more 3-point shots. What happened in the 1990s was much more isolation, and people complained about isolation. And so there's always people complaining about the way the game goes over time. In basketball, I feel like, if anything, it's gotten less in the analytical era, because what we've created is more of a game theoretic world where it's mixed strategies. There's no pure dominant strategy. And so you can't just do one thing. And frankly, even threes is a pure dominant strategy. You can't. It's a mixed strategy, that plus other ways of getting points. And so I feel like it's good in that way. On the other hand, yes, your perspective on Jeopardy is fascinating to me. That it feels like people are following a formula. So you can make a game more complicated. You can definitely throw in randomness, and you can make it a little more complicated. And basketball has plenty of room to do that. Maybe Jeopardy doesn't. Maybe it does. I haven't thought about that. And baseball potentially does as well. And I think you can do that. It forces you to tweak the game. It's funny, Bill James, who I mentioned before, he, in his latter years at this point, has become much more interested in how you change the rules of baseball to make it more interesting. So I think there is some natural evolution there to go towards that. So how do you do that? How do you make it a more robust game? Great question. Great question.
All right.
I have to jump off now, but this was a really interesting discussion, and thanks again so much for joining us tonight.
For sure.
Talk to you later, Chris. All right, it looks like Stuart has his hand up.
Yeah, so my question is about, I mean, in your last answer, you talked a little bit about game theory, and there's a lot that's been sort of done, I think, in sports analytics from a sort of top-down game theory standpoint, where you're incorporating, obviously, data from real games, right?
Yep.
For example, the not punting on fourth down, originally there was this famous paper, right, that took a game theoretic approach to it. But then a lot of times in data science, we are taking more of a kind of naive empiricist approach, where we get some big data sets and we start looking for correlations, and then we follow up from the correlations. So
Yes.
Just as a methodological kind of thing, I'm curious, if you could comment a little bit on how you mix those kinds of methodologies in terms of trying to do sports analytics.
So I think early on, before people have realized a lot, it's not really a game. It is, of course, but it's not. With those simple strategies and stuff, people haven't figured out, like, oh, there is a mixed way, or they tend to think of things as more pure. So once people realize what you're doing, then they realize counter strategies, and that's when you start get to the mixed strategies and all the game theoretic stuff that's actually pretty hard to do. So early on, you do start with simple correlations, or not, I don't like calling it correlations. It's simple advantages that you can see in the data. And then eventually people like, oh yeah, the counter. So the fact that 3-point shots are so valuable. So what was the early thing is the people who are smart, they snatched up the 3-point shooters that were out there for cheap. And so they got good shooters for low money, including Steph Curry, one of the greatest shooters we've ever seen, was paid well below like 30% of the league. And so good shooters were just not valued very much. And then what happened is like, oh, everybody realized, okay, we got to do that. And so then the game theory began like, oh, okay, now we've got to really figure out what the market is for these guys. And we need to figure out who are the defenders that can defend these guys. Those were the first people, and they paid those guys cheaply. But then the market on those guys got high, and so it starts being the first mover. You have this advantage because you're just seeing some simple advantages in the data. But then it becomes like, okay, now we need to figure out how to use our resources the right way, which then gets back to what I said, which is you want to fit what you do to the players you have, because that's how you get the most out of them. And that's how you overcome some of the game theoretical issues. If that answers your question.
One other question, but I'm going to let Aaron go, and then if there's time left, I'll jump back in. But let me
No, Stuart, that's the worst, because your questions are so thoughtful and insightful, and my questions are just anyway. So my question is, sorry, first of all, can you hear me? Sometimes I have trouble with my sound.
Yes.
Okay. My question is really about the surprising variables that that influence the model that you might not have expected. Like, I'm not a sports person, but I do understand the 3 is bigger than 2 thing.
Yeah.
What other variables would you just not predict were going to be as important as they are?
I think there's segments in basketball where you have transition and you have half court, and how transition is much more efficient offensively. And what surprised me still a little bit to this day is that people don't actually look at that. They don't break things down that way. That one's always a surprise to me. And actually one of the things that is crazy to me. So a lot of us look at sports. I will say most casual sports fans tend to look at it for offense. They look at goals scored in soccer. They look at points scored in basketball. They look at what the final score is in football. And they forget to look at defense. That is where there are a lot of advantages that can be gained. Is the defense in many ways is a much more structured, much more of an engineering kind of system, frankly, than offense. Offense in basketball is not purely this, but it is driven a lot by a certain offensive talent. The ability to make a 3-point shot is crazy valuable. But on the defensive side, it is more a system. How do you get people to work together in a cohesive way so that they know where to be and everything? And you can engineer that system in many ways. And people forget about that. It's harder. And because it's harder, people just kind of skip it, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
If I could jump back in then.
Sure.
So, what I think is really fascinating. So having worked and doing, data analytics in a very different kind of environment, well, 2 different environments now, one at a university and now one in government, right? I envy you in sports because of both the volume, but especially the quality and the organization of the data that you guys have available to you. I know there are companies that provide data as a service, and part of it is that it's very standardized, right? There is what is in computer science called an ontology, right? There's classification systems, valid codes, all of that, right? So you're getting uniform data. And I'm just wondering, in government, it's pretty much the opposite extreme, right? I found the university to be somewhere in between. But in government, we really struggle with the data governance, ironically, aspect of getting and having data quality and being able to, the easy part is to do the analysis once you have data that's prepared, but getting to that point is the hard part. I'm just wondering if there's any lessons you have from your experiences about, how could the government try to address that? Are there ways that you've seen that have worked in sports, or just any ideas you have on that?
Yeah. It's funny. So people in sports still complain about data. Crazy. The data we have is so good. In environmental engineering, the data we had was so bad. It's like sparse data, infrequent data. Like, oh, we're managing this aquifer that's 100 miles wide, and we've got 4 samples this quarter. Oh, great! It's great. That's going to tell us a whole lot. Now, yeah, sports data is good, but some of the problems you're talking about still exist in sports. So we get data from all sorts of different providers, and sometimes those don't synchronize at all. And so we end up trying to synchronize things based upon wall clock things, and it's not perfect. One of the things I learned in graduate school was from people who were working for oil companies, and oil companies were collecting massive amounts of data. And they told me that they still spent 40% of their time just dealing with getting data to synchronize, dealing with units. Like they had unit problems all the time. And that 40% of the time was never going to get smaller than 40%, was their belief. And I think it's less than that for me now, but you still end up having to deal with it. I have data that come from a couple different sources that is not easily synchronized. And so what you end up having around the league a lot of times is people will source all their data from one person, one company. And the insights that you get by combining data sets, they don't do that. And if you feel like your advantage is in combining these data sets, then you have to spend the time making sure they synchronize. And sometimes those data sets are hand collected. Like I will hand collect certain pieces of data, usually in a much smaller sample, and look to combine it with other things to see if it tells me a story and if it ends up being very useful, I am going to come up with a way so that it's synchronized, whether it's like tracking it with a computer and making sure there's a wall clock so that I can synchronize it to the wall clock that comes in with other data, or whatever I can do, having key pieces of information that I track also manually that allows me to synchronize it. That's what I do. And having some simple reference points to allow me to synchronize has been key to making inferences across multiple data sets. I don't know how directly that compares to what you have to deal with, but that's what
Well, in comparison, so back in the university setting, we used to have a saying that my team, I always said to our team, which is 80% of data science is preparing the data. 10% is complaining about preparing the data, and everything else is 10%. I would say shifting to government now, and I don't, I want to say I'm being facetious, but I'm not sure I really am. I'd say 99% of the time is preparing the data. I mean, that's the quality issues and the lack of, just, disambiguation, persistent identifiers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a mess that you spend really almost all your time on preparing the data comparatively. So it's tough.
A good thing about sports data, it is very structured. You know what should happen. If there is a missed basket, there is going to be a rebound. And if it's missing, like, okay, maybe we throw out this piece of data. And there's a series of rules that you can use for cleaning up data. And I had to use a lot more of these rules 17 years ago when I first got into this versus now. Now, like, okay, other people have those incorporated into their data, so I don't have to deal with that as much. I actually looked into this about a year ago, and how many of my QC tricks that I wrote 17 years ago are actually getting used. Like, it's pretty rare now. That's good. But yeah, building some of those things you have to give away. I mean, if you want the data providers to be better, you got to give away some of the QC code that you've written. And I've done that. I'm like, yep, this is what I did. And it's an exchange. Like, yeah, it could give me an advantage over some of the competitors I have, but I always felt like, for me, I know how to better analyze data than other people. So I want to beat them on that front rather than cleaning up the data. As I said, I don't know how applicable that is to you, but that's what I think about.
All right, we are now right at 7. Looks like Ryan has one more question, but I'll ask Dean. Do you mind sticking around for Ryan's question, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll let Ryan ask his last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yep.
So go ahead, Ryan.
Sorry, I didn't want to hold this over. I guess my question was, in terms of the analytic approach, it seems very much like strategy, looking at, offense, defense, different things, players currently in the league. How does that compare to, some of the analytical approaches towards, future prospects? Again, trying to get metrics, looking at things in college, because I do find, at least on, in many sports, someone coming out of college with good metrics, all this stuff ends up tanking. And then conversely, you have someone that does the opposite. And so is there still like are they working on ways to try and really capture that better? Or is there just kind of a randomness to that is harder to quantify, as opposed to quantifying offense, defense things and established players and their sets of skills?
I would actually say that the draft is where some of the first analytics was done in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
They took what I had, and what you can do is use a lot of fairly straightforward statistical approaches, which are now more machine learning approaches, to make predictions about how good players are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that work, I've measured how efficient the draft is, the NBA draft, over the last 17 years, and it's gotten more efficient. So you don't have as many failures now as you did in 2006, 2010 timeframe.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the earliest work there, what it did is and you can approach it a lot of different ways, but one of the things was, my boss was a big fan of, can we identify the key stats that said a high prospect is going to fail? Because I want to avoid those guys, because that's what's going to get me fired first. And so it's basically a statistical approach with a very heavy penalty on if you draft someone who fails. And it worked quite well. And now, you can take a draft approach and try to identify which are the biggest risk, high reward guys who also may be high risk, and approach things that way. But that is more standard statistics stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
so those things kind of came about earlier. And I would say they're not perfect now, in part, interestingly, because college kids have figured out how to game the system too. They know certain stats that are key indicators for what makes them NBA prospects, and they have tried to game the system a little bit. So now you have to okay, now we're seeing more failures in some of these guys, and you have to update your models and stuff. So it's interesting.
Gotcha. And does it make it easier on sports that have smaller teams, like the NBA, looking at a smaller amount of players on the field versus, the NFL or any of the others, or is it a similar thing across the board?
I think it's different. Whether it's easier or harder, I don't know. And I haven't worked on baseball draft stuff at all. I have worked some on NFL. So my time at a sports analytics company, I did work a lot on football. So I know a good amount about football. And what happens in football is that it is possible to actually watch every play that a player has in college. Not possible to do that really in basketball. It's almost impossible. And in football, it's harder because guys have very specific roles. So you have to measure, you have to know what that role is, and you have to measure how well they accomplish that role. And that gets a little tricky in both parts, because sometimes you don't know what the role is. You think you know, but their college may have played a different system. And so the role would be laid out a little bit differently for them. And then measuring how well they did that role, getting data on that was for a while kind of hard. People would manually track it. There's now companies that manually track a lot of things. but they may not be manually tracking the things that matter for you.
Gotcha.
So baseball, as I say, I don't know, but yeah, there's a different process. Let's just say for different sports. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much again.
Yeah.
All right, with that, I will. I've convinced myself to never enter into a fantasy league that has you in it. I'll surely lose. But yeah, so thank you for coming out. Appreciate you coming to talk.